The decision to move to Salem, Massachusetts wasn't a calculated one. It was impulsive, born out of desperation. I couldn't stand the stares anymore. Sympathetic, pitying eyes of neighbors, coworkers, even strangers who somehow knew my story. They all whispered the same thing. Poor Rachel. The woman who lost her husband in a freak accident. The woman who smiled politely through clenched teeth while her insides screamed. I needed silence, space, somewhere far enough to feel like a clean slate. The house came to me unexpectedly, part of a will from an aunt I barely remembered. Aunt Margot. I hadn't seen her since I was a child. A distant relative who lived alone in this old Victorian tucked in the woods. My mother had always described her as eccentric. I didn't even remember the house, but when the lawyer called, it felt like a sign, a way out. Way out. And so I left Boston, packed up my life into a single suitcase, and drove 3 hours north to a place that felt like it belonged in a Gothic novel. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a musty combination of old wood and thyme, the kind of scent that clung to antiques and attics. The house loomed over me as I approached. Its once bright yellow paint faded to a dull gray. The shutters hung crooked, and the front porch sagged in a way that whispered leave. But I didn't. I wanted to believe this place could become something more. A refuge, a sanctuary. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of the city, no traffic, no distant hum of life, just the creaks and groans of the house settling. I had set up camp in the front room, the only place not completely overtaken by dust. I brought a bottle of wine and some old records to drown out the emptiness. It worked for a while. But then came the whispers. It was faint at first, almost like the wind rustling through the trees outside. I ignored it, chalking it up to the age of the house. But as the night deepened, the sounds became clearer, unmistakable. Words, a voice, or maybe voices murmuring just out of reach. I froze in place, clutching my blanket like a child afraid of the dark. My rational mind argued it was just my imagination, the product of stress and exhaustion. Yet my body remained tense, every nerve on edge. The morning light brought relief, though I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. I busied myself cleaning, opening windows to let in fresh air, hoping it would dispel whatever strange energy I had felt. As I dusted the fireplace mantel, I found a photograph tucked behind an old vase. It was of a woman, Aunt Margot, I assumed, but there was something odd about it. Her face was partially blurred, as if the camera had struggled to capture her properly. She stood in front of the house, holding what appeared to be a journal. I spent the rest of the day unpacking the few belongings I had brought, trying to make the house feel less like a stranger and more like a home. By evening, I had almost convinced myself the whispers were a fluke, a trick of an old house. Almost. That night, they returned. This time they were louder, closer. The words were clearer, though still indecipherable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the creaking of floorboards. It was human, deliberate. My heart raced as I lay in bed, listening. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but my body refused to move. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for sleep. When I woke, the house was silent again, but the whispers lingered in my memory like the echo of a bad dream. I resolved to explore the house fully, to confront whatever it was that seemed to be calling to me. This place held secrets, and I needed to know if they were mine to bear. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the windows, a rhythmic drumming that felt oddly soothing after the events of the night before. The whispers still echoed faintly in my mind, as if they had followed me into my dreams. The rational part of me tried to dismiss them. Old houses make strange noises, I told myself. It's nothing. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. Determined not to let fear consume me, I decided to explore the house in full daylight. The rain cast a dim, gray light across the rooms, amplifying the shadows that seemed to stretch and curl in the corners. Armed with a flashlight and a stubborn resolve, I started with the attic, a place I had avoided since arriving. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I climbed, the air growing colder with each step. The attic door stuck at first, as if resisting my intrusion, but a sharp tug broke it free. Inside, the space was cluttered with forgotten relics, dusty trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and I had to stifle a cough as I ventured further in. Something about the room felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very air was weighted with secrets. In the far corner, I noticed a trunk that seemed out of place. Unlike the others, it was pristine, almost untouched by time. Its surface was polished, the brass lock shining faintly even in the dim light. My curiosity piqued. I crouched down and ran my fingers over the intricate carvings on the lid, vines and flowers intertwined, forming a pattern that felt oddly familiar. I hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside was a collection of journals, their leather covers cracked with age. I picked one at random and opened it, the pages filled with dense handwriting that belonged to Aunt Margot. The entries started innocently enough. Daily musings, notes about the garden, and mentions of distant relatives. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Margot wrote about hearing voices in the house, whispers that grew louder as the nights passed. She described vivid nightmares and a sense of being watched, her paranoia escalating with each entry. Then came a chilling passage. They know everything. The house has taken their secrets, their sins. I can hear them calling to me, reminding me of things I wish I could forget. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. My hands trembled as I read, the words confirming my own experiences. But what secrets was she talking about? And whose voices were they? As I delved deeper into the journal, I found a list of names, family members I didn't recognize, along with dates and cryptic notes. Some were crossed out, while others were underlined with ominous phrases like, "never at rest" and "burdened by regret." My heart raced as I realized these weren't just random relatives. They were people connected to this house, their lives somehow tied to its haunting presence. A sudden creak from behind snapped me out of my thoughts. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but the attic was empty. Still, the air felt charged, like someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching. My skin prickled with unease, and I quickly gathered the journals before retreating downstairs. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they weren't just sounds, they were words. I could make out fragments of sentences, voices calling my name, accusing me of things I didn't understand. I covered my ears, but it didn't stop the voices. They were inside my head, relentless and unyielding. I had opened something, stirred something, and now it wasn't going to let me go. The whispers didn't stop after that night. If anything, they grew bolder, following me during the day, bleeding into my thoughts like an infection. Their tone shifted, no longer indistinct murmurs, but sharp accusations. The words stung as if they knew exactly where to aim. You could have stopped him. You wanted him gone. You never loved him. Not really. Evan. They were talking about Evan. I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer, while the house was alive in a way I couldn't explain, feeding off my fear and guilt. It wasn't just the house, though. It was me. I was part of this, somehow connected to whatever terrible history lived in its walls. The journals were only the beginning. I needed to know the rest. The basement. It had been locked since I arrived, the old wooden door sealed with a rusted chain. Something about it felt final, like the house itself was daring me to open it. With a pair of bolt cutters I'd found in the garage, I snapped the chain and pushed the door open. The air hit me like a wall, damp, suffocating, carrying the faint stench of decay. The basement was pitch black, the single light bulb flickering as if struggling against the darkness. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing a room far larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with objects, old photographs, letters, personal belongings. It was like a mausoleum of forgotten lives. In the center of the room stood a mirror, its ornate frame carved with the same vine and flower motif as the trunk in the attic. But the surface wasn't reflective. It was black, like a pool of ink. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. My own reflection didn't appear in the glass. Instead, I saw flickering images of people, faces twisted in anguish. They screamed silently, pounding against the surface as if trapped inside. Aunt Margot's journal had mentioned this mirror. She called it the Keeper. It held the secrets of those who lived here, their sins, their regrets, their truths. I felt its pull, a magnetic force drawing me closer. The voices became coherent again, and this time they weren't just accusing, they were showing me. The mirror's surface rippled, and I saw Evan. He was driving that night, had his face tight with frustration as we argued. I had forgotten the details, or maybe I had chosen to forget, but the mirror didn't allow omissions. It replayed everything: my words, sharp and cutting, my silence when he begged for understanding. The crash wasn't just an accident. It was the culmination of 1,000 little wounds we had inflicted on each other. I fell to my knees, sobbing. The whispers softened, as if satisfied with my pain, but the mirror wasn't finished. It showed me other faces, family members I didn't recognize, each tormented by their own failures. Then I saw myself, older, gaunt, my eyes hollow with the same regret that consumed the others. I understood what the house wanted: to take me, to make me part of its collection. "No," I whispered, "not yet." Summoning what little strength I had, I smashed the mirror with the flashlight. The glass shattered into 1,000 shards, and the voices screamed in unison, a sound that shook the entire house. The ground trembled, and the lights flickered before plunging into darkness. When I woke, I was outside, lying in the wet grass as the house burned. Flames licked at the sky, devouring the place and all its secrets. I didn't remember escaping, but I didn't care. The house was gone, and with it the whispers. Or so I thought. As I stood there, staring at the smoldering ruins, I felt it again. That presence, watching, waiting. And in the faint distance, almost inaudible, I heard a single whisper: "You can't run from yourself." The first time I noticed something was wrong with Ashwood, it was in the way people spoke about the missing. Or, more accurately, didn't speak. A small town like this, nestled in the rolling hills of Maine, should have been abuzz with theories and whispers. But here, there was silence. Every name, 5 in total, was uttered like a curse, and any attempt to press for details was met with tight-lipped refusals and wary glances. For me, though, the silence only stoked my curiosity. I had moved to Ashwood a month ago, fresh from a professional scandal that had tarnished my name as a journalist. Boston had chewed me up and spat me out, and this quiet, picturesque town had seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. I told myself I wasn't here to make waves, just to get my footing and find stories that wouldn't rock the boat. But these disappearances? They were impossible to ignore, especially once I saw the pattern. It started with a name: Mr. Grayson, the proprietor of a shop called Reflections of Time, tucked away on the edge of town. His antiquary dealt almost exclusively in mirrors, small ones, full-length ones, intricately carved ones that seemed to pulse with history. And the missing people? Each one had purchased a mirror from his shop shortly before vanishing. I remember the first time I stepped inside. The air felt different, heavier, as though it had a presence of its own. Mirrors of all shapes and sizes lined the walls, their frames ornate and gleaming despite the dim lighting. My reflection stared back at me from dozens of angles, and for a moment I felt disoriented, as though the room itself had expanded to swallow me whole. Looking for something specific? His voice was smooth, with just the faintest trace of an accent I couldn't place. Mr. Grayson was tall and impeccably dressed, his suit pressed and his shoes polished to a shine. He didn't seem to belong in a town like this. His pale blue eyes held mine a moment too long, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips as though he knew exactly why I was there. "No," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just browsing." He nodded, gesturing toward the nearest wall. "Take your time. Each piece has a story, you know. They're waiting for the right owner to discover them." The words sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I wandered the shop, pretending to examine the inventory while stealing glances at Grayson. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as though he was perfectly at ease in a space that felt so wrong. I left without buying anything, but the image of the mirrors stayed with me. At night, I dreamed of reflections that moved independently of their owners, of faces that weren't mine, staring back at me. It was absurd, I told myself. Just my overactive imagination running wild. But when I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The next day, I started digging. The town's archives were sparse, but I found mentions of the shop dating back decades. The curious part, Mr. Grayson's name appeared every time the shop reopened. His face, his style, unchanged, as though time had no hold on him. I knew I was onto something, but the deeper I looked, the more resistance I faced. Locals avoided me in the street, their eyes filled with fear rather than suspicion. I had the distinct impression they knew more than they let on. That's when I decided to return to the shop. This time I wouldn't leave empty-handed. I had to see what it was about those mirrors that seemed to ensnare everyone who owned them. The second time I entered Reflections of Time, I wasn't just browsing. This time, I was here for answers. The bells over the door jingled as I stepped inside, and that same heavy air settled over me like a damp fog. The mirrors seemed to multiply overnight. There were more of them, I was sure of it, though I couldn't explain how. My own reflection greeted me from every angle, distorted by the warped glass and gilded frames. Mr. Grayson appeared from the back room, his smile as sharp as ever. "Ah, you've returned. Did something catch your eye?" I hesitated. My plan had been to confront him directly, but now, standing under his unwavering gaze, I felt a flicker of doubt. Instead, I nodded toward a smaller mirror on the wall. Its frame was a deep mahogany carved with delicate patterns of leaves and vines. It seemed unassuming enough, at least compared to the others. "This one," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's beautiful. What's its story?" Grayson's smile widened, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or triumph. He reached for the mirror and handed it to me carefully, as though it were a living thing. "Ah, an excellent choice. This piece has been waiting a long time for someone like you." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile. "How much?" He named a price that was surprisingly reasonable. Too reasonable, in fact. I hesitated for a moment before handing him the cash. "Enjoy," he said softly as I left, his voice following me out the door like a shadow. The mirror sat on the small table in my living room, propped up against the wall. I had planned to inspect it more thoroughly, look for hidden compartments or markings that might explain its connection to the missing people. But as soon as I placed it down, I felt an overwhelming urge to look into it. Not just glance, but really look. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection stared back, tired and slightly haggard from another restless night. But then something changed. It was subtle, a flicker at the edge of the glass, like a ripple across still water. I leaned closer, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, and then it happened. My reflection blinked. I didn't. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking the mirror off the table. My heart pounded as I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen. But the reflection was still now, perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I was tired, I told myself. Maybe the light had shifted or the mirror was warped. But that night, the dreams returned. Only this time, they were worse. I saw myself trapped behind the glass, pounding on it as if it were a prison. The reflections around me weren't mine. They belonged to others, their faces twisted in fear and agony. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, the mirror's presence looming in the corner like a silent predator. I grabbed my notebook and started writing down everything I could remember from the dreams. The faces, the whispers, the way the reflections moved like living things. It all felt too real to dismiss. The next day, I went back to the archives. This time, I wasn't just looking for mentions of the shop. I was looking for the names of the missing, and I found them, buried in the town's obituaries. Each one listed as deceased, though no bodies had ever been recovered. Every one of them had purchased a mirror from Reflections of Time. That night, as I stared at the mirror again, I realized the truth. The missing weren't gone. They were inside, and if I wasn't careful, I would be next. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The mirror sat in the corner of my living room, its surface dark and still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling it was watching me. Every time I glanced at it, I felt an inexplicable pull, as though it was calling me. I had to end this, whatever it was. I needed to understand what was happening before I became just another name on a list. The first thing I did the next morning was head back to Reflections of Time. The door was locked, the closed sign hanging crookedly in the window. I pounded on the glass, my fists echoing in the empty street. "Grayson," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I know what you're doing. Open the door." The door swung open without warning, and there he was, calm and composed as ever. "Mr. Cooper," he said, his tone annoyingly pleasant. "What seems to be the problem?" "You know exactly what the problem is," I spat, pushing past him into the shop. The mirrors glinted in the dim light, their surfaces shimmering as though alive. "What are these? What are you doing to these people?" Grayson tilted his head, his expression unreadable. The mirrors don't do anything, he said softly. They merely show the truth. What you choose to see is entirely up to you. That's not true, I said, my voice shaking. I've seen them. Faces, people trapped inside. The missing are exactly where they've always been, he interrupted. They never left. They simply chose to stop running from themselves. Before I could respond, he stepped aside, gesturing toward a door at the back of the shop. If you're so curious, Mr. Cooper, why don't you see for yourself? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had come this far. I needed answers. I stepped through the door and descended a narrow staircase into a basement that smelled of damp earth and decay. The air grew colder with every step, and when I reached the bottom, I saw them. Rows upon rows of mirrors, their frames ornate and glinting in the low light, and their surfaces, they weren't reflections, they were windows. I approached the nearest one, my breath catching in my throat. A woman's face stared back at me, her eyes wide with terror. She pounded silently on the glass, her screams muted by the barrier between us. Her face was familiar. It was one of the missing. They're all here, Grayson's voice echoed from behind me. Every one of them. They couldn't face the truths the mirrors revealed, so they gave in. Now they belong to the mirrors just as you will. I turned to face him, my fear boiling into rage. Why? I demanded. Why are you doing this? He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was cold, calculating. I am merely the keeper. The mirrors demand what they demand. I simply give them what they need. I turned back to the rows of mirrors, and that's when I saw it. My own face, staring back at me from one of the glass panes. But it wasn't me. It was distorted, warped with fear and pain, my hands pressed against the inside of the mirror as though trying to escape. No, I whispered, stepping back. No, this isn't real. But the pull was stronger now. The mirror I had bought from Grayson, still in my apartment, had already claimed me. I was no longer just looking into the mirror, I was inside it. I felt the world twist around me, like the walls of the shop fading into darkness. Grayson's voice followed me as I sank into the glass, cold and final. You wanted the truth, Mr. Cooper. Now you'll live with it forever. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a place that wasn't a place, a void of endless reflections, faces staring back at me, their mouths open in silent screams. My hands pressed against the glass, but it was no use. I was one of them now, a prisoner of my own curiosity. Above me, in the shop, another customer stepped inside. Grayson greeted them warmly. The cycle had already begun again. It had been weeks since I'd written a single word. My laptop sat on the desk, screen blank, cursor blinking like a heartbeat that mocked my inability to create. Outside, the rain pattered against the windows of my cramped Portland apartment, an endless symphony that mirrored my growing frustration. I had a deadline, a looming one, and my editor's voice replayed in my head like a broken record. Daniel, we need something groundbreaking. No more excuses. But groundbreaking wasn't happening. Nothing was happening. The ideas that used to flow freely now felt stuck, lodged somewhere deep and unreachable. I'd sit for hours, staring at the keyboard, hoping for inspiration to strike. Instead, there was only silence. That's how I ended up in Forgotten Pages, a tiny bookstore hidden in a back alley I'd never noticed before. The place was dark and claustrophobic, its shelves crammed with books and papers that seemed like they hadn't been touched in decades. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air, comforting and suffocating all at once. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound notebook sitting alone on a wooden table near the back. It wasn't flashy or ornate, just a plain, unassuming journal with an aged, dark brown cover. Something about it drew me closer. Interesting choice, a voice said behind me, startling me. I turned to see an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a knowing smile. He looked like he belonged to the shop, like he'd been there as long as the books. That one's special. How so? I asked, picking up the notebook. It felt heavier than it looked, the leather cool and smooth under my fingers. He shrugged, his smile widening. Every writer needs the right tools. Maybe this one will help you find your story. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. The notebook wasn't marked with a price, but when I asked, he waved me off. Consider it a gift, he said. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Finish what you start. There was something unsettling in the way he said it, but I thanked him and left quickly, clutching the notebook as though it might vanish if I let go. Back home, I sat at my desk, the notebook open in front of me. Its pages were blank, a soft cream color inviting in a way I couldn't explain. For the first time in weeks, I felt the urge to write. I grabbed a pen and began scribbling. A simple scene, nothing ambitious. It was about a detective named Jack Lawson investigating a series of strange disappearances. I wrote about him walking into a dimly lit bar, questioning a bartender who seemed to know more than he let on. It was generic, cliché even, but it felt good to get something on the page. I wrote until my hand ached, filling 2 pages before finally closing the notebook. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I turned on the news out of habit. My mind was still half asleep when a report caught my attention. A man had gone missing downtown, last seen entering a bar. The reporter described the scene with eerie familiarity, almost word for word what I'd written. I froze, the coffee mug trembling in my hand. It had to be a coincidence. There was no way, but the details matched too perfectly. The bar, the bartender, even the detective. My heart raced as I ran to the notebook and flipped it open. The words stared back at me. Impossibly real. That was the moment I realized I'd stumbled onto something extraordinary, or maybe something terrible. I couldn't stop staring at the notebook. The words I had written the night before now felt like a spell, something that had pulled the events from my imagination into reality. My mind reeled, racing through every rational explanation I could muster. Coincidence. Maybe I had subconsciously pulled the details from a news story I'd seen before writing, even though it felt impossible. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a coincidence. The notebook was doing something. The logical part of me screamed to test it again. If it happened twice, it couldn't be a fluke, right? So that's what I did. Sitting at my desk, I flipped the notebook open to a fresh page. My hand hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper. What if I was wrong? What if I was right? Shaking off the doubt, I started writing. This time, I kept it simple. A jogger finds an abandoned briefcase in a park. Inside, there's a photograph of a child holding a balloon with the words, "Find me," scrawled on the back. No twists, no mysteries, just a short, contained scene. Satisfied, I closed the notebook and set it aside. Hours passed, and I tried to convince myself that nothing would happen, that this was just an overactive imagination fed by lack of sleep. But later that evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post in a local group. Someone had found a briefcase in Washington Park, and inside was a photograph of a child holding a balloon. My stomach churned. The details were identical. I didn't know whether to feel exhilarated or terrified. The notebook worked. It really worked. At first, I saw it as an opportunity. Writers spend years trying to bring their ideas to life, but now I could make mine real with just a few lines. My first thought was to use it for success. What if I wrote a bestseller and everything I created in it came to life? The possibilities were intoxicating. Over the next few days, I wrote small scenes. A lost dog reunited with its owner. A homeless man finds a wallet filled with cash. Each time, the events unfolded exactly as I'd written them, as though the world was bending to match my imagination. But then, the cracks began to show. It started with a scene about a character named Eleanor Gray, a private investigator. I wrote her as tough, resourceful, and a little cynical, a throwback to the noir detectives I'd always admired. I imagined her solving crimes, navigating moral gray areas. She was perfect on the page, until she showed up in my apartment. It was a Friday night when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but the moment I opened it, I froze. There she was, exactly as I described her, a sharp suit, cropped black hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through me. "Daniel Brooks," she said, her voice low and steady. "We need to talk." My mouth went dry. "Who? How?" "You know who I am," she said, stepping past me into the living room. Her presence was commanding, like she belonged here, even though I knew she didn't. "You created me, didn't you?" I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat as she paced the room, glancing at my desk and the open notebook. "This is a joke to you, isn't it?" she snapped. "Creating lives, tossing us into impossible situations for your entertainment. Did you ever think about what it's like for us? The chaos, the suffering?" "I didn't know you were real," I stammered. She scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "Real enough, And I'm not the only one. Others are coming, Daniel. They're not happy. A chill ran down my spine as her words sank in. The notebook wasn't just a tool, it was a doorway, and I had opened it without understanding the consequences. Eleanor leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Fix this," she said, "or you'll regret ever picking up that pen." When she left, I sat in stunned silence. The room felt darker, heavier, like her presence lingered long after she was gone. My mind raced. Fix it? How? And what did she mean by others? For days, I avoided the notebook. I stuffed it into the bottom drawer of my desk and told myself I wouldn't touch it again. But it didn't matter. The stories I had written, the lives I had created, weren't confined to its pages anymore. They were loose, wandering through my world, and they weren't done with me. It started small. I'd see shadows move where they shouldn't, fleeting shapes that disappeared the moment I turned my head. Objects in my apartment would shift places, seemingly on their own. Then came the whispers, at first faint like a distant radio, but growing louder each night. By the time I realized what they were saying, I couldn't sleep. They were voices, demanding, accusing. Some belonged to characters I recognized. Others didn't. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a voice clearly for the first time. "Daniel," it said. It was a low, guttural whisper coming from my desk. Slowly, I got up and crossed the room, my legs trembling. The notebook sat in the drawer where I had left it, but the drawer was slightly open as if it had moved on its own. When I opened it, the pages weren't blank. They were filled with words I hadn't written. "You started this. Now finish it." My heart pounded as I read the words. The pen sat beside the notebook, seemingly waiting for me. I wanted to run, to burn the damn thing and never look back, but I knew that wouldn't work. The stories were alive, and they weren't going to stop until I gave them what they wanted. The next morning, I sat at my desk and began to write. I thought if I could tie up the loose ends, give the characters closure, maybe it would end. I started with Eleanor, crafting an ending where she solved her case and found peace. But as I wrote, the words changed on the page, shifting into something darker. "You don't get to decide," her voice said from behind me. I spun around, and there she was again, her eyes burning with anger. "You think you can tie a neat bow around this and make it all go away?" "I'm trying to help," I pleaded. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You're not the one in control." Before I could respond, the room darkened. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the corners deepened until they formed shapes, other characters I had written. A villain from a crime story, a broken, vengeful man from a tragic romance, a child from a fantasy I'd abandoned halfway through. They surrounded me, their faces filled with anger, sorrow, and desperation. "You left us," one of them said. "You created us, gave us pain, and then walked away." "I didn't know," I shouted. "I didn't know you were real." Their eyes burned into me as the notebook's pages began to flip on their own. Words appeared rapidly, too fast to read. I felt something pulling at me, a force stronger than anything I'd ever known. The shadows closed in, their voices growing louder, merging into a deafening roar. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else, a blank, endless space, white and featureless. The notebook floated in front of me, its pages turning slowly. I reached for it, but my hand froze midair as if an invisible force was holding me back. "You're part of it now," a voice said. I turned, but there was no one there. "You were never the writer, Daniel. You've always been the story." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't the author of this world. I was just another character written into existence by someone or something else. The notebook wasn't a gift. It was a trap, a way to keep the cycle going. And now, I was part of it forever. The last thing I saw before the white void consumed me was the notebook closing, its cover worn and familiar, waiting for the next person to open it. The storm rolled in faster than any of us had expected. One minute, we were cruising down a quiet country road, laughing about Tyler's terrible playlist and Emily's stubborn refusal to use Google Maps, and the next, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. Rain slammed against the windshield of our van, and the narrow, winding road ahead blurred into an indistinct smear. "Maybe we should pull over," Claire said from the passenger seat, her voice tense. She had been our unofficial leader for most of the trip, the one who kept us on schedule and mediated our petty arguments. This doesn't look like it's letting up. Josh, who was driving, squinted at the road and shook his head. Where? We haven't passed a gas station or a rest stop in miles. He was right. We'd been driving through a stretch of wilderness, the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in on either side of the road, cutting off the sky. No houses, no signs of life, just miles of dense forest and the occasional broken-down fence. I told you we should have stuck to the main highway, Tyler muttered from the back seat. His sarcasm had been a constant companion on this trip, and while it usually earned a laugh or an eye roll, tonight it only added to the tension. Emily, sitting next to him, was clutching her map like it was a lifeline. It's not my fault the GPS stopped working, and this map doesn't even have all the roads listed. How was I supposed to know this was a dead zone? Mia, who had been quiet for most of the ride, spoke up from the far corner of the van. Look up ahead. There's a turn. Her voice was soft, but we all heard the relief in it. Josh slowed the van as we approached the intersection, the headlights catching a wooden sign partially obscured by overgrown ivy. The letters were faded, but still legible. Ravenswood. A town, Claire said, almost to herself. Finally. We turned onto the road, which quickly narrowed and twisted as it descended into a valley. The storm seemed to lessen as we drove, the rain easing into a light drizzle. And then we saw it, the village of Ravenswood. It was like something out of a storybook. Quaint wooden houses with wraparound porches, flower boxes overflowing with bright blooms, and cobblestone streets that glistened under the rain. A church steeple rose above the rooftops, its bell softly ringing in the distance. But something about it felt wrong. As we entered the village, people emerged from their homes, smiling warmly at us. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright, as if they'd been expecting us. A man in a crisp white shirt waved us down, his grin practically splitting his face. Welcome, he said, his voice cheerful. You've arrived just in time. Come, get out of the rain. We'll take care of you. Josh exchanged a glance with Claire, who shrugged. Let's just ask for directions and get out of here. The man led us to a large house near the center of the village, where a group of similarly smiling people greeted us. They ushered us inside, offering towels and tea. The warmth of the house was comforting, but the way the villagers watched us, silent, their smiles never fading, set me on edge. As we sat around the table, sipping tea and trying to piece together our next steps, I caught sight of something through the window. A figure stood in the shadows of the street, watching us. Unlike the others, they weren't smiling. Their face was blank, and their eyes were fixed directly on me. When I blinked, they were gone. I think we should leave, I said, breaking the silence. But when I looked at my friends, I saw hesitation in their faces. Where would we go? Claire asked. We don't even know where we are. We'll figure it out, I insisted. This place isn't so bad, Emily interrupted, her voice dreamy. I mean, look at it. It's beautiful, and the people are so kind. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The room was quaint, with lace curtains and an antique quilt on the bed, but it wasn't mine. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the village, the unsettlingly cheerful strangers. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and rubbed my temples, the feeling of unease still lingering like a shadow. I found the others already gathered in the living room. The villagers had laid out a breakfast of fresh bread, eggs, and fruit, but I wasn't hungry. Josh was chatting easily with one of the villagers, a woman with a fixed, almost doll-like smile. Claire stood by the window, watching the cobblestone streets outside. Emily and Mia were seated at the table, sipping tea and looking far too comfortable. "Where's Tyler?" I asked, glancing around the room. "He went to check on the van," Claire said without turning around. It still wouldn't start last night. He thought he might be able to figure it out now that it's dry. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could get out of here after all. I'll go check on him. The streets were eerily quiet as I stepped outside. The sun shone brightly, but the air felt heavy, as if the village itself was holding its breath. I found Tyler crouched next to the van, his hands smeared with grease as he fiddled with the engine. "Any luck?" I asked, though his frustrated expression already gave me the answer. Nope, he muttered. It's like the thing just stopped working. Nothing's wrong with the engine, but it won't turn over. I glanced around, my unease deepening. The villagers were out now, sweeping porches, tending gardens, but their movements felt off. Too synchronized, too deliberate. They smiled and waved when they saw me, and I forced myself to wave back. We need to leave, I said quietly, crouching next to Tyler. Even if it means walking. He glanced up at me, his brow furrowed. You really think it's that bad? I didn't answer, but the look in my eyes must have been enough. He nodded. Okay, let's get the others. Back at the house, Claire was still by the window. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. There's something strange about this place, she said as I entered. No phones, no cars, no electricity that I can see. It's like they're stuck in another time. They probably like it that way, Emily said, her tone light. Not everyone needs Wi-Fi to survive, Claire. It's not just that, Claire insisted, her voice dropping. It's them. They're always watching. Have you noticed that? I had. Every time I looked out the window or turned a corner, I felt eyes on me. Tyler says the van won't start. We should pack our things and leave. Walk, if we have to. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the villagers outside. But where would we go? We don't even know where we are. Anywhere but here, I said firmly. This place isn't right. As we packed, I noticed something strange. My phone, which I had tried to use the night before, now showed only one photo in its gallery. A single image of the village's church steeple. Every other photo, every contact, every message was gone. Claire, I called out, my voice shaking. Come look at this. She frowned as she took the phone from me. That's impossible, she muttered. It was fine yesterday. It's not just the phones, Mia said from the doorway, her voice trembling. I can't remember my mom's name. Her words hit us like a slap. One by one, we realized it wasn't just objects disappearing, it was pieces of us. Tyler couldn't recall the name of his old high school. Emily struggled to remember her favorite song. The memories were slipping through our fingers like sand, and the more we tried to hold on, the faster they faded. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, the villagers gathered in the square, their cheerful smiles now seeming more like masks. From somewhere in the distance, a bell began to toll, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed through the village, sending chills down my spine. We need to go. Now, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But when we stepped outside, the streets didn't look the same. The paths twisted and turned, leading us back to where we started. No matter which way we ran, the center of the village loomed ahead, the bell still ringing. And in the middle of it all, the villagers stood waiting, their smiles wider than ever. The bell's toll echoed in my head as we stumbled into the village square, our panic rising with every step. The villagers stood in a loose circle, their smiles frozen, their eyes locked on us. It wasn't just unsettling anymore, it was horrifying. Their faces seemed unnatural, as though the act of smiling was a grotesque mask they couldn't remove. Josh stepped forward, his voice trembling. We don't want any trouble. We just need to leave. One of the villagers, an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes, tilted his head. Leave? He said, his voice light and lilting, as though we'd asked a silly question. But you're meant to be here. You belong here now. No, Claire said firmly, stepping beside Josh. We don't belong here. We don't even know where we are. The man's smile widened impossibly, and for a moment I thought I saw something else behind his eyes, something dark and hollow. You'll remember soon enough. Before any of us could respond, the bell tolled again, louder this time, and the villagers began to hum in unison. It wasn't a melody, just a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate in the air around us. My skin prickled as I felt the sound reverberate through my chest. Run! Claire shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling her toward one of the narrow streets that led out of the square. The rest of us followed, our footsteps pounding against the cobblestones as the hum grew louder, filling the air like a living thing. But no matter which street we took, we always ended up back in the square. The villagers were waiting for us each time, their smiles unwavering, their hum growing more intense. The square itself seemed to warp, the streets twisting and shifting as though the village was alive, reshaping itself to trap us. We're not getting out of here, Tyler said, his voice breaking. This place, it's not real. It's some kind of nightmare. Then we find the center, Claire said, her eyes blazing with determination. Every nightmare has a source. We find it, and we end this. We headed toward the church, its steeple looming above the village like a silent sentinel. The hum grew louder as we pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was thick and oppressive, and the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows cast distorted shadows across the walls. At the far end of the church, an altar stood bathed in an eerie, flickering light. Symbols were carved into the wood, ancient and incomprehensible, and behind it a massive tapestry depicted figures kneeling before a dark, faceless shape. As we approached, the hum reached a deafening pitch, and the villagers began to pour into the church, their footsteps eerily synchronized. They formed a circle around us, their smiles now twisted into something far more sinister. "This is where it begins," the old man said, stepping forward, "and where it ends." The altar began to glow, and the light spilled onto the floor, forming shapes, faces, memories, fragments of who we were. I saw flashes of my childhood home, the faces of my parents, the sound of my name being called, but the images were fading, dissolving into the light. "They're taking everything," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "They're erasing us." Claire grabbed the tapestry and ripped it down, revealing a hidden doorway behind it. Without hesitation, we pushed through, finding ourselves in a small, dark chamber. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it a strange, black orb pulsed with light. "This has to be it," Claire said. "This is what's holding us here." Josh reached for the orb, but as his fingers brushed against it, the room erupted into chaos. The villagers' hum turned into a deafening roar, and the walls seemed to close in around us. The orb pulsed violently, and one by one, my friends began to disappear. "No!" I screamed, trying to hold on to Claire as she faded from view, her face frozen in a mix of determination and terror. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the orb shattering into 1,000 pieces, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the village square. The streets were quiet, the villagers nowhere to be seen. My friends were gone. I looked down at my hands, and they didn't feel like mine. My reflection in a nearby window showed a face I didn't recognize, a smiling face. The village was quiet again, waiting for the next travelers to arrive, and I was one of them now. The air in Elliott felt heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the summer heat, though that clung to the skin like a damp blanket. It was the weight of despair. The plague had come quickly, a shadow that spread across the town like wildfire. First, it was whispers of a fever here, a rash there. Then, the symptoms grew impossible to ignore. Entire families were confined to their homes, coughing, writhing in pain, their faces flushed with unnatural heat. By the time the first burial happened, the church's pews were nearly empty. I stood at the pulpit that Sunday morning, staring out at a congregation that had once filled every row. Now, the wooden benches were dotted with only a few familiar faces. Margaret Hensley, seated in the front as always, clutching her weathered Bible. Tom Carter, looking thinner than I'd ever seen him. Sarah, the bright-eyed girl who usually sang in the choir, sitting beside her frail grandmother. I tried to speak words of hope, of faith, but my voice faltered. What could I say that hadn't already been said? How could I reassure them when I wasn't even sure myself? My hands gripped the edges of the pulpit, my knuckles white. "The Lord is our shepherd," I began, my voice cracking, "and he will guide us through this valley of shadow. We must hold on to our faith and trust that his plan." "His plan?" Margaret's voice cut through the room, sharp and unwavering. She stood abruptly, her frail frame shaking with emotion. "Pastor Caleb, we've prayed, we've begged, and where has it gotten us? My sister is dead, my grandson too weak to move, and half this town will follow them if we don't do something." The room fell silent. I could feel the weight of her words, the unspoken agreement from the others. "What do you suggest, Margaret?" I asked quietly, though a part of me already knew what she would say. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her Bible tighter. "There's the well," she said finally, her voice a mix of defiance and fear. "The old one in the forest. My grandmother used to tell stories about it. The water there, it heals." Murmurs spread through the room. I could see the mixture of hope and dread on their faces. Everyone had heard the stories. Of miraculous cures, yes, but also of visions, curses, and madness. The well had been abandoned for decades, left to become a relic of superstition. "That's just a story," Tom said, though his voice lacked conviction. "And if it's not," Margaret countered, "if it can save us?" By afternoon, a small group of us had gathered at the edge of the forest. Margaret led the way, her frail body moving with determination that belied her age. Sarah walked beside me, her usually bright demeanor subdued. The forest was dense, the air cooler beneath the canopy of trees. The further we walked, the quieter it became, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. "There," Margaret said, pointing ahead. The well stood in a clearing, its stones moss-covered and ancient. Symbols were etched into the stone, faint and weathered, but still discernible. The water inside glowed faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed alive. I hesitated, my chest tightening as I approached. The air around the well felt charged, as if it held a power far greater than I could comprehend. Margaret didn't wait. She dipped a small jar into the water and drank deeply, her hands trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the color returned to her cheeks, and the trembling stopped. "It works," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It works." The others began to move forward, their desperation outweighing their fear. But as I stood there, staring into the glowing water, I felt a pull, an invisible hand reaching into the darkest corners of my soul. And in the reflection of the water, I saw him, my brother Daniel. Blood on his hands, blood on mine. The air around the well felt heavier with each passing second, as if it were alive, wrapping itself around us, judging our every move. I couldn't take my eyes off the water. The glow pulsated like a heartbeat, and in the ripples, I swore I saw his face again. Daniel, his eyes locked with mine, filled with the same accusation I had tried so hard to bury. "Pastor," Margaret's voice cut through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. Her face was transformed, healthier, almost radiant. "It's a miracle," she whispered, holding her trembling hands out in awe. Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "You have to tell the others. This can save us." The rest of the group was already dipping their jars into the water, drinking with the same frantic hope. Sarah hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the well as she looked at me. "Should I?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. I didn't know how to answer. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, that the glow in the water was something unnatural. And yet, Margaret stood before me, alive and well, her strength restored in a way that couldn't be denied. Could I really stop Sarah, or anyone, from taking the only hope we'd seen in weeks? Before I could respond, she took a jar and drank. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then she let out a soft gasp, her face lighting up. "I feel lighter," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. By the next morning, news of the well had spread through Elliott like wildfire. The church was fuller than it had been in weeks. Though the faces I saw weren't filled with hope, they were desperate, lined with the weight of suffering and the fear of death. Margaret stood proudly at the front, telling anyone who would listen about the water's miraculous power. But as the day went on, the cracks began to show. It started with Tommy Carter. I found him pacing outside the church that evening, muttering to himself. His clothes were damp, and his skin glistened with sweat despite the cool air. "They're watching me," he whispered when I approached. "Who's watching you, Tommy?" I asked gently, but his eyes darted around wildly, unable to focus on mine. "The shadows," he said. "They're everywhere. I can't make them stop." Margaret, too, began to change. Her strength remained, but she would trail off mid-sentence, staring into the distance as if listening to something no one else could hear. "They speak to me," she said once, her voice almost reverent. "They know everything, about all of us." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face in the water, his lips moving as if trying to speak. I finally gave up and sat at my desk, staring at an empty piece of paper. Prayers came easily to me before, but now my words felt hollow, like reciting lines I didn't believe. The knock at the door startled me. Sarah stood on the other side, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Pastor, I'm scared," she said. "I keep hearing things, voices, and I can't remember my mother's name." Her words chilled me to the bone. The next morning, the situation in Elliott worsened. More people had gone to the well, and more were starting to exhibit the same symptoms: murmurs of voices, whispers of figures in the shadows, and the gradual erosion of their memories. It wasn't just their names or their loved ones. They began forgetting who they were before the sickness. Desperation set in as I realized the truth. The well wasn't saving us. It was offering a cruel exchange: health for sanity. And yet, when I saw Sarah collapse in the church pews that afternoon, coughing violently, her strength almost gone, I knew what I had to do. I stood before the well once again, the glow pulling me closer. The water shimmered, its light flickering like a taunt. I dipped my hands into the cold liquid, my fingers trembling. As I brought the water to my lips, I whispered, "Forgive me." The moment the water touched my tongue, everything changed. My mind was flooded with memories, painful, vivid, inescapable. Daniel's face loomed larger than ever, his voice ringing in my ears. "You left me. You chose to save yourself." I fell to my knees, gasping as the visions consumed me. Somewhere deep within, I knew there would be no turning back. The visions didn't stop. They tore through my mind like a storm, each one sharper and more vivid than the last. I saw Daniel again, standing in the clearing where it had all happened so many years ago. His face was bloodied, his eyes full of betrayal. I tried to speak, to explain, but my voice was swallowed by the same oppressive silence that surrounded the well. "You left me," his voice echoed, low and venomous. "You let me die." The memories flooded back, memories I'd buried so deep that even I had started to believe my own lies. I hadn't just failed to save him, I'd chosen not to. The guilt hit me like a wave, and I collapsed to the ground, clutching my head as the voices around me grew louder. "Pastor Caleb," they whispered, overlapping, insistent. "You are no shepherd. You are a coward." I don't know how long I lay there, trembling at the edge of the well, before the voices subsided. When I opened my eyes, the water's glow had dimmed, but the sense of dread remained, clinging to my skin like damp cloth. My hands were still shaking as I stood and stumbled back toward the church. The town had descended into chaos. People wandered the streets, some crying, others laughing hysterically. Tommy was on his knees outside the church, clawing at the dirt as if trying to dig his way out of something only he could see. Margaret was inside, standing at the pulpit, speaking in a language none of us could understand. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, and the congregation sat frozen, staring at her as if in a trance. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice cracking as it echoed through the church. This is not salvation. The well is a curse, not a blessing." The trance broke, and all eyes turned to me. For a moment, I thought I'd reached them. But then Margaret's head snapped toward me, her gaze sharp and cold. "You drank from it too," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "You are no different." I froze. She was right. The shame of what I had done burned deep in my chest, but I couldn't let it stop me. I looked at Sarah, who sat trembling in a corner, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We have to destroy it," I said, turning to the crowd. "It's the only way." Convincing them was harder than I expected. The well had its claws in all of us, feeding on our fears and regrets. But somehow, I managed to gather a small group willing to help. Sarah, Tommy, and a few others who hadn't yet succumbed completely. Together, we returned to the forest, the air heavier and darker than before. As we approached the well, I could feel its pull again, stronger this time. The glow was brighter now, almost blinding, and the symbols etched into the stones around it seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The others hesitated, but I stepped forward, gripping the iron cross I had taken from the church altar. The moment I touched the stones, the ground beneath us shook. The air filled with a deafening hum, and shadows began to rise from the edges of the clearing, dark, formless shapes that circled us, their whispers growing louder. "You can't destroy it," Margaret's voice came from behind us. She had followed, her face twisted into something unrecognizable. "It is us. It is everything." I ignored her, raising the cross high above my head. With all the strength I could muster, I drove it into the heart of the well. The glow exploded in a burst of light, and the air was filled with an agonized scream. Not just one voice, but hundreds, maybe thousands, all crying out at once. The shadows recoiled, and the ground cracked beneath the well. Water poured out, dark and foul, and the glow finally flickered out. The forest went silent. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The well was gone, replaced by a jagged hole in the earth. The others were still with me, but their faces were blank, as if they couldn't comprehend what had happened. Back in Elliott, the air felt lighter, but the town would never be the same. The people who had drunk from the well, myself included, were marked by it, our memories fractured and haunted. The plague had lifted, but the cost was far greater than any of us could have imagined. As I stood at the pulpit the next Sunday, I looked out at the broken faces of my congregation and realized I couldn't stay. The guilt was too heavy, the memories too vivid. I left Elliott that evening, walking alone into the wilderness. But even as I left, I felt the weight of something watching me. And in the distance, faintly, I could still hear the whispers.